Welcome everybody to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Course Pro. And this is May the 16th. This is a fourth office hours for the spring summer course. We're moving on to zones in terms of our next assignments. And today we've got a number of great questions. Really excited to go through these. And as I was talking before, for everybody who's asking questions specifically about their site, so for Andra, if you could put on your link to your portfolio, that'd be useful. I'm just going to quickly pop through these questions and see if we need Wesley's more general question. Yeah, Daniel, I don't know if you're on here, but it'd be important.
But if the questions are not for my current site.
Oh, it's not. It's just for a
no, it's general.
Hypothetical. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
And for Daniel, that would be good to have your portfolio, and Dave has already put it in. Perfect. Okay. Let's jump into good old May 16th. All right, so first question from Andra. Would you use sheep's wool in the garden as a mulch, for example? Absolutely. And of course, the good people of Wales have already been through this many, many times. So we used wool quite a bit as a mulch in a farm we were at because it came with the farm as it had a number of sheep that were being sheared. I haven't used it in composting as this link suggests, but from what I was reading, it looks to be fine and it makes sense because if it works in a mulching context, it'll help to retain moisture and it'll create a bit of a coral reef, if you will, for microorganisms. So I don't see any problem with that whatsoever. One of the nice things about wool is that because it's made of a number of materials, including keratin, it doesn't break down as easily. So that mulch is a bit more persistent, which is nice. Its occlusion of weeds is phenomenal in that it can create quite a mat. But because of some of the lanolins in the wool, it can become a bit water repellent. So it's something to keep in mind that there's a pro to it, but there's also a con in that it may become a bit hydrophobic, where it's shedding water off of it. But if you use it loosely, this is kind of the back and forth with all mulch. Either it's really tight, and when it gets wet, it creates sort of a mat. And this is true of leaves in particular. When leaves get wet, they can create an impermeable layer. But if they're broken up and they have some aeration to it and they've got some interstitial airspace in between them, then it actually works out really well. So I would say, yep, go for it. Be careful about applying too much and watch to make sure that if it does become an impermeable layer, at least it's laid in such a way that the water actually collects in the areas or the holes for the plants that you want. So we have another question here. What strategy, I'm going to pop this out. Could I apply for more water retention on a thin strip of land located on a relatively steep hill? The plots are cut so that the house lies closer to the valley with their small backyards, and then they continue on up with vineyards and orchards. But of course, one can only alter their own strip of land going up the hill. How wide's the strip you're thinking of?
Maybe 10 meters.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. So with something that's 10 meters, you could still work with something like swales. That would be doable. Or if you wanted to forest that area, you could do the net and pan swales or the smiley face up swales. If you were in more of a rocked area, you could do one rock dams, where these are leaky dams where you're piling rocks in such a way that water can flow out, but they can still stall for a bit and have a chance to sink down. So if the ground is impermeable, if you're on bedrock, things of that nature, you can then—
It's quite sandy.
Quite sandy. Okay, great. Awesome.
Yeah,
so in that case, what I would do is I would do swales if it's sandy, because the infiltration will be high.
Got it. I thought it was too narrow maybe for doing the swales or something. But
no, and then the other thing you have to think about is access. So if this is an area that you need access, you may want to be conscientious that you'll put stepping stones in the trough of the swale. So that way, when you come up over the berm, you can still step over and it still feels generally easy. At 10 meters, I remember a job we did that was quite narrow, and we did terraces up I think it was close to 10 meters. It might've been a little bit bigger, like 12 or 13. but we did terraces, and then the terraces were crossbacks. So basically there was quite a flat area, and then it dipped down and came back down, quite a flat area, dipped down. And that worked really well because the terraces themselves, and I've talked to a couple of people this week about it, were back graded. So if this is the slope, then our terraces, instead of being perfectly level, are slightly back graded. Anywhere between 0 and 5 degrees is common. And then the terrace itself works like a swale. But instead of having a berm, which swales are generally tree growing systems, you can then have flat areas if you're looking to do small crops, or if you're wanting to make small gardens or aesthetic gardens that you want people to go and reach up to. This is a bit of the pattern language from Christopher Alexander. If you have something of interest for people to hike to, or if you have a place to hike, have something of interest to land at. So you can have either an aesthetic garden or a contemplative garden, or just a hardscape place that's nice to sit and view, and a bit of a sit spot on a piece of land.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. How can we tell the wind air draft which way to go, and so that we can create a nice breeze in the sitting area in the garden? How can we design for that? So, the best way is direct observation. So being in a place for a long period of time, being it in all seasons, experiencing the wind, watching the wind, being in the place. This is one of the reasons why we talk about staying in a piece of land or staying in a design site for a year before any design is implemented, because it's worth its weight in gold. I have a friend and a client who's become quite famous in the farming space, and came onto a piece of land and had a lot of money that he wanted to put into it right away, and he wanted to buy and do and all this. And I think I convinced him at least to hold off for a little bit, but it's come back in great return, because every time he's gone out and experienced the landscape, he goes, "Oh, I didn't notice that. I didn't see that. I didn't understand that." So direct observation, being out there, feeling the wind, can be a brilliant way of doing this. But also tree flagging. So tree flagging is looking at the tops of trees, and especially conifers, and seeing which way that the tips are permanently bent. If you take a look online, there's a number of tree flagging diagrams that show the angle of which the tree is flagging is the general average speed of that wind. And also, of course, the direction of it will give you the sense of where it's coming from. That for me has been one of the better ways to get a sense of where the trees are, or pardon me, where the wind is. And I was just at a site about 75 acres. I was walking the line, and the clients were remarking that it got quite windy, but they couldn't remember what direction. And so we had all these trees around us, and I said, "Great, let's look up." And so we looked up together, and they go, "Wow, this is amazing. The wind's all coming from the east." I was like, "Yeah, that's what it looks like." And that doesn't preclude that you might get some gusts from the north or the south, but if you have consistent, persistent wind at an interval, and those trees are such that it's constantly creating a leading pattern within the tip of the tree, it'll show you generally the direction it's moving. And then you can start to create wind tunnels to bring area into a place for like a sitting garden or something like that. And this was done quite a bit in the Middle East to channelize wind into a courtyard house over a pond that would then cool the rest of the house. And we can use that as a technique or a tool.
Nice. I didn't think about the inclination of the trees, but yeah, it's a point. If you don't live there and see how it goes, yeah.
Ah, great.
Nice. Thanks.
Hey, welcome. Mr. Wesley, most of my suburban site would be considered zone 1 or zone 2, just based on proximity to the house and current level of interaction. Can you elaborate on how designing and articulating zones might differ between larger rural farms and sites and urban suburban sites? Would there be simply no zone 3-5, or are there certain characteristics such as a semi-wild space that may slot into a 4-5 by virtue of limited foot traffic? Great question. So again, zones is a way of understanding. Whoa, we'll get everyone just. Thanks so much. Zones is a way of taking a look at the center of human initiative, and then getting a sense of the frequency of travel of the humans on site, and generally what the different zones are being used for. So usually zone 1 is a daily, zone 2 is a couple times a week, zone 3 is a couple times a month, zone 4 is generally when needed throughout a year, and zone 5 is generally left untouched. These are guidelines. These are not hard and fast rules. As long as you explain yourself in your assignments, you're good to go. So in many sites, we don't have some of those zones. So especially in urban sites, we don't have zones 1, zones 2, zone 3, zone 4. A couple of really creative students who were looking at it more in a three-dimensional landscape were saying that the tops of the trees were the zone 5 because they didn't manage them. Birds came in, insects were there. They were able to actually view a bit of what the inherent flora and fauna were, which I thought was a brilliant way of looking at it. It's not necessarily gone wild, so to speak, but it does have that ability. Generally, when we get into the urban sites, zone 1 is the house, the walkway to the driveway, and the driveway itself. Zone 2 tends to be areas that we might go for garbage or recycling, things of that nature. And zone 3 tends to be those areas that we're mowing or we're frequenting a little bit more infrequently. So you don't necessarily have all the zones in one place. And in rural sites, sometimes you don't have zone 3s, sometimes you don't have zone 2. A lot of people who live in rural sites treat them as an urban site in that they drive their drive their car to their house, and the rest of the land they leave as is. It's it's a zone 4 or 5. They don't do anything with it. So in terms of designing and articulating zones, remember that there's two ways of using zone. One is a audit. So you're taking a look at the site, getting a sense of frequency of pathways and zones of usage, and saying, okay, these are these different zones. And then going into a sense of, okay, well, are different elements in different places, and are they not necessarily where people are? So Larry Santoyo, a permaculture teacher and instructor, former LAPD out of Los Angeles, used to say that the best place for the lettuce garden is in between the car door and the house door. It's that place that has the most amount of frequency. And it was his way of recommending the brain to go, okay, let's think about this for a second. If we want to have something of high usage, we better put it close to the house. When you get into partnership or you start working with people that don't understand zonation, and they have lots of land, they want everything far away from the house. But unfortunately, the further you put things away from the house, the less likely they are to be managed. So one of the things that I've had in friction with partnership is that they'll want the garden far away from the house, and I want it as close as possible because I want to grab my morning tea. I want to walk around the garden, see what's happening, and really have that old adage of the best fertilizer is the gardener's farmer's shadow, because we're constantly there. When we get into a rural setting, generally what we're looking at is we're trying to understand around the house, where's the best place to put some of the high touch amenities or the high touch food systems or other types of systems. So things like gray water, things like gardening, things like annual gardening, so to speak, chickens, vermicomposting, sauna, outdoor shower, outdoor kitchen, smoker, dehydrator, things of that nature. We want them close by so that way we can attend to them quite easily. As you move further out, you start going layer by layer, and you haven't done this yet, but the zone layer, the microclimate layer, your base map, especially in terms of your contour lines or your water flow, will start to dictate in concert with the goals articulated in the client interview, will start to give you a sense of what might be able to go where. And this is something that was taught to me years ago, is that if you really work with these different overlays, the design kind of pops out of itself. So if you have a sunny, dry area that's close to the house, chances are this is going to be the annual garden. This is a place that needs quite a bit of sun. As we move further out, if we start to get into cooler, moister places, this may be where we're putting more of our shade tolerant species, or maybe we're thinking this is where mushroom cultivation is going to happen, because while mushrooms do need a bit of sun in terms of the heat from it, they don't necessarily photosynthesize or don't photosynthesize. You need to be able to place those things appropriately. So when you're looking in the zonation conversation, it's great to get a sense of what's existing, because some of those things might be misplaced. We used to run a 21-day PDC down to Cuba with Ron Berzan was the lead and the host with the urban farmer. And so we go to these 3 different areas. We'd start in Vedadero, we'd go to Sanctus Spiritus, and then we'd end up in Santiago de Cuba. And as we were moving throughout, we had the opportunity to take a look at a bunch of different biomes and different scales and sizes, balconies to farms. And I remember when we got to Santiago one year, one of the design sites, because we did design and install live with students that were pre-established, and we would work on a design together. And what was amazing was they had a banana plantation directly outside the back door. Now, for those that don't know, bananas are actually a herb. You can cut down the stalk, you can take the corm, you can replant that, and in the tropics, within a couple weeks, you're back into full vegetative photosynthesis. So one of the things we did is we moved that banana grove further back and put this amazing sunny close to the back door spot as annual production. So sometimes you move things, or you suggest to move things, because of that zonation conversation that comes out. Wesley, does that answer your question? Is Wesley still here?
Yeah, that definitely gives me some good direction. Thanks, Jeff.
Awesome, great. Daniel, I don't think Daniel's here today. Nope. On this property with very steep east-west slopes, I'm planning on developing Zone 2 and Zone 4 garden trails, which will emulate a hunter-gatherer utilization of these areas of the property. The Zone 2 area will be a managed food forest, including more regular watering, mulching, pruning. It'll also be where we plan to incorporate grafted fruit trees. The energy and time spent in this zone will be significantly more than the planned Zone 4. The Zone 4 will be treated as a feral food forest, which will only be providing initial earthworking and watering to assist the plants to get started. After the initial assistance, the plant and fruit nut trees will be left relatively on their own. It's also hoped that these fruit, nut trees, mushrooms, berries, plants in the zone will become regenerative. The elk and other wild animals will provide the pruning, fertilizing, and overall taking in the zone. As a result, the natural ecosystem will have much more influence on these planting in the zone. Is it a reasonable way to look at Zone 2-4, at least for this property? Sure. Anything's reasonable with a significant amount of work. Zone 2 sounds, Zone 2 sounds perfectly fine. Zone 4, I think the elk in particular will do more than just the pruning. They'll probably do the full eating down to the stem. So especially when we move into areas where we're going to have less interaction and intervention, we have to think about protection. So when we're planting out in our unfenced areas, chances are we're going to either be creating tree cages, or we're going to be creating tree tubes and hoping that the trees get beyond what's called browse height, which is where ungulates like elk can get to and start to nibble. Things like your fruit trees, your nut trees, and berry plants will definitely be a frequented stop for most of these animals. And if you don't protect them, chances are they will become full food for them. That said, there's a lot of strategies we can work with in terms of those feral food forests. One of them is cages. The other one is grafting. So there's a number of plants that can be grafted to other plants. The one I'm thinking of right here for your intents and purposes is pears can be grafted to hawthorn. So if you take 2 or 3 leaders in the center of a hawthorn that's already created a good deer skirt, that's a skirt to which the deer can't actually get into the top, you can then graft pear scion. These are the cuttings that we'll take from the fruit trees we want, and we'll graft them to the rootstock, which in this case would be the hawthorn. And that's a great way to start to put more food out into that landscape. The other way is to do what's called sacrificial or chaperone plants. So in your area, things like sea buckthorn, Hippophae rhamnoides would be a good pick of planting those around a tree that you're wanting to grow up, only because they've got quite thick thorns and it's hard to get into and around and through, and they also have their own berries. So chances are it'd be a bit of a distraction crop for animals that are around there. Generally, the further away you go from the house, the more you'll find that animals will come into those plants. And if you're okay with that, if that's part of the design, which is great, fantastic. It's about, feeding everyone. I don't think, or maybe actually Fahar is in this group, but he's speaking a little bit about overplanting his mangoes and overplanting his jackfruit for the fruit bats and some of the arboreal wildlife that are coming at that. So that way the areas around the house are more theirs, and the things further away from the house. And generally when we look at that, we tend to go in heights. So generally when there's a lot of birds in an area, what we'll do is we'll put sacrificial crops like mountain ash. These are trees that get quite tall and they have a good berry set, and we'll leave that for the birds. The birds generally don't want to get close to the ground for fear of predation anyways. So yeah, I would say it's reasonable, but you should also reasonably expect that a lot of that feral food will probably become feral food for the flora and fauna in the area, and just to expect it or to design around it. But great question. And then David, the site I'm working on is a public.
You have some good points.
Oh, Daniel, you're here. Great. Yeah. Go ahead. Daniel, does that answer your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, yes, it did. And actually the plan is there for that to be more, as much for the elk and the other animals is for me on that point. So it is kind of designed that way, but also to look at how do we develop a food forest that is more regenerative. And by defining this as managed versus feral and planning it that way is how I kind of differentiate how far do we want to carry it towards the regenerative food forest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great thought. There's a number of strategies and techniques I've seen. Sepp Holzer's site over on the Holzerhof down on the southern side of Austria near the Italian border. He created a number of fruit tree terraces where the fruit trees were planted on the slope of the terrace, and then the terrace itself was there to drop nuts onto and then create a nursery. So he created something that is self-managed where he can go and pick as many nut tree seedlings as he wants, because the area generally is self-sowing and self-watering and self-managing. So I think if you take a number of the concepts we have in the class in terms of catching and storing water, making sure that those plants are planted with some kind of passive water harvesting, be it a net and pan system or on a swale system or even on hugelkultur. We had a client who we put about a 125-foot hugel in for them that became their native nut nursery that was really far back in the property that they didn't go to all that much. It would definitely be a zone 4. So using that concept and creating these systems that will grow up, fantastic. Some of these systems will have a lead time to build up, so that way they do become a flywheel and they start producing. Whereas if they're young tender shoots right off the bat, those can get mowed down really quickly. So thinking about succession, getting them to a height where they can self-support themselves and they can't be taken down by browse would be important.
Okay, one other yield though that I'm planning on getting out of the zone 4, and that is seeing the elk and the animals.
Mm.
And yet in a wild setting, because I don't want to have them coming onto my zone 1 where they become quote domesticated, but up on the hills, they're totally in their own state and are totally wild in their own, how they relate to humans. But yet I can still see them and observe them when they bring great joy to us.
Are you dead?
Great thought. I love that idea.
Are you
Yeah,
dead?
I think the level of success with that will
Are you
depend
dead?
on
Are
the
you
deer, how hungry they are. As much as we might want to create wildlife feed and whatnot, in lean years, animals will come right up to the door if they are hungry. So keeping that in mind and keeping in mind the intent of what you're going for, I think it's a great idea to be managed and moderately managed, and in a way that also provides that aesthetic viewing quality, but also has them more situated away from your growing zone is a great thought.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, and then David. Hey, Javin. The site that I'm working on is a public urban farm with a permanent dwelling. What strategies do you suggest for determining zones in the site? Like Wesley's case above, most of the site seems to be a zone 1-2 gardens and food forest with the addition of some sites mixed in. Awesome. Well, let's bring up your site here. And we'll jump in and start to take a look at this. So Dave's site is in Edmonton, and it's an interesting site because it is that urban site. So Dave, generally what I do in urban areas is I start to get a sense of access and egress. So where is the entrance and exit? This is one of the reasons why I was so specific on folks showing me where the doors were on buildings, and also putting in gates and whatnot to show where people access and egress. And the reason for that is you really want to get a sense, and you'll do this in the zone assignment, and this is all explained in the tutorials. You'll get a sense of starting to put in your zone walkway. So I'm going to make things up here. So if we have different areas that have different walkways, then when you start to get a sense of how common those walkways are, so let's say this is 1x a day. So 1x a day, this is 1x a day. This is 1 to 2x a week. And generally these areas are not tended all that much. We could start to formulate an idea that our zonation, and again, we've chosen these zone colors only because they're the most common in terms of coloration. Red tends to be high frequency, yellow or orange less so, yellow less so. And moving out, we don't use green or blue because green is for vegetation and blue is for water. So generally we would say that these areas in my mind would be our zone 1. Make a little legend here, Z1. And then we'd probably have our orange areas, and maybe for the intents and purposes of demonstration, we'd say actually there's a zone inside here that's actually more zone 3. So this would be all of our zone 2. So this would be Z2. And then maybe we're saying that our zone 1 is, or zone 3, pardon me, is kind of in there. And then this is the rest of our zone 3, because yeah, there is some activity here, but it's, you know, maybe on a monthly basis, maybe a little longer. So in that situation, we have a sense of what is the frequency of our traffic. And from there, we have different elements. Now, let's say, for example, in this situation, somebody put the compost as is quite common. They put it really far away in the back. Let's say over here. And you go there every single day. Well, you might say that in this situation that there's actually a little zone 1 over here. That's a little island in all of this that people are coming to and going to. This may also make sense to say, okay, well, now that I see this, is this good enough reason to keep this back here? Maybe it brings people to the back when normally they don't go there, and it's a good place for them to be. But we actually want to bring it closer. So depending on your design considerations, that might be something you want to consider. Usually I leave out the buildings. Usually we call the building zone 0 or that center of human initiative. And when you get into some social permaculture folks, they'll consider the person zone 00, just as a conversation. If you look at some of the work of Toby Hemingway, recently passed in the Permaculture City, as well as Pia Yeoman and the Forest City, I think that's the book name. These types of areas, you can take a look at an entire city in different zonations. So friends of mine years ago, they had an urban site. They didn't have a place for long-term crops, and so they were part of a community garden. But the plot in the community garden was purely for potatoes, and they got a bit of flack because people were saying, well, that's not the point of a community garden. It's for herbs and tomatoes, and they had a preconceived idea, and they only went there once to plant and once to harvest. And then they went there frequently to top up the straw mulch because they used the Ruth Stout method. Ruth was a woman in the late 1800s, early 1900s who realized when she wasn't able anymore to dig her potatoes, she decided it was time to try something different. And so instead she started working with, just gonna mute everyone here. There we go. She started working with straw. and then putting her potatoes into straw, putting her garlic into straw, putting a little bit of compost. And then as that plant comes up, as we work with potatoes, we hill them, and you can hill with straw. And so I've been doing this for a number of years, and it's the easiest, quickest way to make potatoes. And it's one of the easiest ways to get clients or yourselves into growing food. If it's easy, people tend to do it, and ain't nothing easier than root stout. So when we're working with this design, Dave, I would say that go with frequency of usage, take your pathways, get a sense of how much they're walked, take a look at the different elements themselves. Maybe some of them are more frequented or less frequented. And from there, using that idea of zone 1 is daily, zone 2 is weekly, zone 3 is monthly, zone 4 is whenever during the year, and zone 5 is usually left alone, so we can view what the natural ecology is, the flora, the fauna, taking a look and seeing what it's like. Really think of zone 5 as the book of nature that we open to read and learn from, and we can always go back to read again when not if we get it wrong. That's the way I go about this. Now I see that Andrew's hand is up, but Dave, I want to make sure that I've answered your question. Does that answer your question? Is there more? Do we have a follow-up question?
Oh, no, that's really helpful. Combined with your answer to Wesley's question, I think it was just what I needed. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. Great. Thank you, Dave. Andrew?
Yeah, on my side, the site I'm working on, they are not currently moved in. They're still renovating. So I cannot see the patterns of how they come and go. I can imagine how it usually is. But do I design for the future because I know they want a garden and all that stuff? And do I make the zones for the future design? Yeah.
Just consistent. So this first zone conversation is just what is. So if they're not there and they come up the drive and they're around the house, okay, that's generally going to be zone 1, and everything else is probably going to be a zone 4 at this point, unless there's some areas that really are not attended to and you can't see any sort of human interaction there. It's like, no, this has been left for a year, so this is more naturalized, and that's a zone 5. I would say you probably only have 1 or 2 or 3 zones there. And the reason for that, again, is we're showing a snapshot of what is and what they want and where we might put things around that property so that way they work. This is something that's coming up right now. The class before you is just into their final assignments and their final design. So we've got 3 major design assignments. We've got the plant design assignment, we've got the zone 1 assignment, and then we've got the full final design assignment. And as they're going through these assignments, they're starting to come up with exactly this conversation. Well, how does this all work? And this is one of the reasons why having overlays and using the same position of the map, which is what I talked about in the base map tutorials, is so important, because you can literally bring in each layer as an image, change the transparency, and start to see those layered one on top of the other and go, okay, this is a zone 1, this is a microclimate. And it looks like with the sector analysis, I have to amend for the wind. We have some pest on this side, maybe a raccoon or something like that. And we have an issue because it's too dry. Okay, but it's warm. So now we know that the design implementation is calling for passive water harvesting and supplemental irrigation. And because it's close to the house, probably some of those zone 1 plants that you come to every day. So if it's close to the kitchen, usually herbs. And this is the other reason why I say in that tutorial, mark where the kitchen is and the closest access point to the kitchen. You can make a cook super happy if you put all the herbs they need right outside that kitchen door. You can make a cook very unhappy if you put the herbs at the back side of the garden, which always happens. There's always somebody who buys a plant. It's like, oh, I bought you a plant. I planted it for you. Where'd you put it? In the back. Okay, well, it's going to die. So part of that is putting things close by the house so that way you can go and grab them and then bring that into the house. And if you go into things like pizza ovens, which I'm a big fan of, doing an Adobe or a Cobb pizza oven, having all my fresh herbs right there. So my rosemary, my oregano, my basil, my Thai basil, all of these quick picks that as you're finishing a pizza, you're grabbing and you're ripping and you're throwing onto tearing, not ripping, onto a pizza are there. So it really just depends in terms of what that layered conversation is. Did that answer your question, Andrew? Sorry.
Yeah, it's clear. What it is now, that's what we put it, and then we can revisit it in the later assignments. Okay, got it. Thanks.
You're welcome. Dave?
Yeah, I'm glad Andrea asked that question. So this week is snapshot of current state because my site is actually an abandoned site, and the design is for a future vision. So does that make it all zone 4 or 5?
Yeah, so if it's abandoned, then it's probably mostly a zone 4, if not completely. I imagine there's going to be an access point, which might be the zone 1, where you've walked to the site and looked around, and maybe like just this little area. I don't know where the access point is. And then the rest would be zone 4. And there may be some areas that have gone so wild that they're back to zone 5, where it's like, no, this is purely wild. That call is up to you if it's a zone 4 or zone 5. If it were me, let me think about this for a second. If it were me and it looked like a regular overgrown urban site, I'd probably call it a zone 4. But if I had a keen eye and I was like, oh, that's interesting, that's a native chokecherry, and it looks like generally I'm seeing the strata of chokecherry underneath it, you're about to come up to what's called the local ecology survey, which is getting a sense of what is the climax ecology and what are the different states of ecology that come to it. It's really useful to understand that blueprint, that natural blueprint that's going to be happening if we walk away, when we walk away, when we're gone. And with that, when you come to a site, and you may not have that education right now, which is fine, but in that case, I would just call it a zone 4, and then probably a small little zone 1 where you're coming to and going from. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm going to pop back to the questions, see if anybody's put in a new one. I'm going to get rid of that. No new ones. Okay, great. Any follow-up questions that have come up as we've been chatting here for anybody? Okay.
Kevin,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, mine are mostly lesson 4 questions. I'm not sure if those will be relevant for this.
No, go ahead.
Oh yeah, all right. First of all, I have a challenge with my client. They are willing and they are quite active in the development of the project and the document as I work on it with time. But the challenge that I have is they are hardly available to help me conclude it in time for the delivery of the assignments to meet my deadlines. So I was hoping that maybe you could have some tips on how to manage that, such that I'm able to meet all my deadlines. And then the second one is in lesson 4, we are sort of like cataloging different plants in different microclimates. So the biggest struggle I have is that I don't know all these plants by name, although I grew up around them. I don't know them by name, unfortunately, or what they're used for. And all the humans I could find who could assist me with it are only going to be available to come with me to site in about week after next. That's obviously after the assignment's deadline. And I thought I found a work around that by using the Google Lens app to look at the leaves, and then it can help me identify the plant. But what I quickly realized was that I quickly lost confidence in the results that I got. Some of them were accurate, but some of them I wasn't totally sure because it kept stressing that this plant belongs in Mexico or this one is more popular in the US or South America, but it doesn't say anything about my region or specific to my location here in Africa. So I was wondering how it can help me with that, or what kind of resource I can use that can quickly teach me how to identify plants. Yeah, those are my questions.
Great questions. Thank you, Victor. What are the resources that can quickly teach you the plants? None yet that I found that would meet the requirement of my mind of quickly. Plant ID has been very difficult for me to learn. It also didn't help that my mentor had a didactic memory, and you could name a plant either common or Latin, and they would tell you the common or Latin and the growing zone and all the rest of it, propagation, and yeah, very intimidating. So my approach has been to approach learning plants with this idea of starting to build a structure of what's on site. And so it's a slow process and it's worked for me. So when I go to a new site, especially if it's outside of the biome that I've become known, or that I know, what I do is I start with the plants that are at my feet. So I just start with the very first one, and I'll take 2 or 3 different photos. One, I'll take a photo that has a clear shape of the whole structure of the plant. So from ground to tip of leaf extension. And I'll take 2 or 3 photos around that in case it changes its shape. Then I'll do a close-up of leaves or buds or flower or fruit or seed. Then I'll take a look at the stem and the underside of those leaves. And normally I'll do this with my hand in frame so I get a sense of size. So if my hand's there, I have a sense of the size because I always have this. So it's easy for me to come back for reference. If I put a coin there, a lot of people like using a standard coin of their currency, which is fine. But I always have my hand, so I always figured it works pretty good. From there, and it's a lot easier now, and so my process now has changed a little bit, but I used to basically go to what's called a dichotomous key. And so pretty much internationally, there are dichotomous keys for every region in every country. And they're called di keys or dichotomous keys that then allow you to go from question to question to question to question to question to come down to the exact plant that this plant is with a very high level of confidence. I have gotten lazy the older I've become. And I really like a number of these apps that are out there. And I've just put them into the main resource list on our question, which is Picture This and iNaturalist. So normally what I'll do is I'll have 2 or 3 of these apps and I'll compare the 3 of them. Then there are a number of what plant is this groups, either on Facebook or Reddit. I find Reddit is usually more reliable, REDDIT. What plant is this? Also, what mushroom is this? But there may be local groups, local Facebook groups or social media groups. I'm not saying those platforms exclusively. I'm just saying in the area that I live, those are the platforms that generally my populace is on. And I will email or not email, I will post that photo and saying, hey, this is where this was found. Here's the zone. Here's generally the Latin long coordinates. Here's what I think it is. Any confirmation? Amazingly, that is more reliable for me than using the different apps, because you'll get 4 or 5 people, and just the general way that people are in the competitive nature of people who are on the internet. They all want to find the right answer first, and they all compete and tell each other that they're wrong and they don't know what they're talking about. And then they'll usually find a photo that's highly referenced from something like Audubon or Wikipedia, and then I can compare. This is the most important stage in this whole conversation. I then document that. So I take that usually into a working Google Doc or a spreadsheet, and I document, okay, I found this plant in this location. This is generally what it is. And then I go into a learning process with it. So everybody learns differently. Most of us, before we were put through school, were kinesthetic learners because we didn't have language. You wouldn't think that's a controversial statement, but you have to be careful about everything you say these days. And with that process of learning, I found that the Anki, A-N-K-I, process of learning, where you have flashcards and the level of confidence or the level of success you have in knowing what's on the backside of that flashcard will change the repetitious nature of when you see that flashcard. And there's a number of online services that do this for free. Anki does it for free. But basically what I do is I create flashcards of the plants of the place I'm in, and then I go through them regularly to learn those plants, because it's like anything. If you don't have repetition, you won't get there. But the most important thing is working with those plants. So normally new plants that come into my sphere of influence, I then start to work with. That might be monitoring them, that might be propagating them, that might be starting to observe the different plant relationships around them. And this is different from a horticulture degree or an agricultural degree. I will then put underneath that Anki card associated plants. So this is a bit of a gilding conversation. Now I want to know, well, where am I seeing this plant? And generally, what am I looking at it? Once I'm pretty confident about those pieces, I'll usually dig up the plant and get a sense of its root size and spread and depth. Roots Demystified by Robert Couric is a great introduction to root scope and scale. And once you understand and start to realize that gilding is probably more to do with root size and shape than it is to do with what we can physically see above ground, it'll change your entire way of looking at designing. Beyond that, you may want to, if you don't have a group like that in your area, starting a group like that. Sometimes that goes with reaching out to local conservancy groups or biologists, individuals who are in the area, and they might already have their own guides. When I was in Kenya, it took me a long time to finally find a Kenyan guide for native plants. But this is the legwork I had to do. I had to reach out to conservation groups and biologists and people in the agricultural ministry. And then in Uganda, because Uganda is split into kingdoms and each kingdom has its own agricultural minister, going through them and finding the plants and explaining what I'm doing elicited an array of resources that I then had to work with. But the most important thing is building this repository of your own information, because if this is a site you're going to be on, or if this is an area you're going to be on for a very long time, you want to get to know the plants and know them really well. And the legwork you put into learning those plants is the legwork that keeps that plant alive and the memory of it alive in your mind, as opposed to just having a guide that you can turn to all the time. There was a time before my plant ID where I just had guides and I looked them up, and the time after when I started to actively build a repository of my own information changed dramatically how much that stayed in my mind. I've had a number of head traumas as of late over the last 5 to 10 years. And it's remarkable the number of plant information that was the first to go. So after my second and my third concussion, I had to go back and relearn a number of plants, and this brought them back really quickly. And so now that I have this repository, I can go to it really quickly and really easily, and I can understand the plants that are in and around my area. If you want a great example of this, there's an author named Thomas Elpel, E-L-P-E-L, who created a great book called Botany in a Day. And Botany in a Day is a great introduction to learning about plant ID by the way you look at plants. Now, he's in temperate, I think he's Idaho, if I'm correct. And I learned a ton from Tom. What I love about Botany in a Day, if you do pick it up as a book, is that when you're reading it, you'll see all these little dots besides the plant names. And some of the dots are filled in, some of the dots aren't. And I had a chance to meet with Tom and have some conversations with him. I'm like, Tom, tell me about the little dots. He's like, oh, that's for me. It's like, what do you mean it's for you? He's like, well, I wrote Botany in a Day for me. That was his plant repository. That was him classifying and codifying his education. Like, oh, all mint stems are square and they have opposite leaves. Right, I have to remember that. And then in the mint section, it's all the mint plants. And it's the mint plants that he knows and has found are colored with the little dot. And so because he's self-published and he publishes on demand now, the new editions, you'll see there's more and more dots because Tom never stops learning about plants. So he's made this something that other people looked at and was like, oh, I want that, turned it into a product and then had it for people. So Victor, what I would say to you is that if you don't find that list in and around your area, this could be a wonderful opportunity to build that and start to build potentially a resource guide for other people to work with. Does that answer your second question, or are there any follow-up questions for question 2?
Oh, no follow-up question. Actually, you answered my question quite in a way that's quite inspiring. Now I know that I have to put together my own database of sorts that I can maybe over time invite other experts who are more knowledgeable than I am to bring some structure to it, and hopefully one day have it online and easy to be searched by anyone else. So thank you for that. You've answered me quite well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Also, if anyone hasn't looked ahead yet, assignment 19 has access to the Capital Plant Database, which was created by Daniel Housley and Paula Westmoreland. This is an international database that is sourced by an international group of designers and is constantly being updated, that is searchable by multiple functions and multiple attributes of plants. It's an amazing place to start to learn and grow, and through OSU, you all have access to it for free, which is remarkable. What's really important about that plant database is that you can start to understand the different attributes you may want to list in your own database, or you may want to use that database as your repository of information. So one of the things they do is they allow you to become a data collector or a data inputter for that site. So you may want to consider that as well. In terms of your first question, especially when you're working in a class like this where your design sites are usually voluntary, one thing I found with students is if you can explain the level of value they'll receive if you can receive timely feedback and then you can produce timely results with your assignments, will dramatically increase the value they can get as being a voluntary site. So basically connecting everything. So the quicker you get me information, the more I can do more work on this, and thus my final product can be of more value to you. Basically telling them what the value of it is. The other thing you might want to do, Victor, is that you may want to look in advance of the assignments and start to package, 4 or 5 assignments together with a short list of questions. Like I need this answered, this answered, this answered, and this answered. So that way you're kind of chunking everything together. So that way they only have to focus on your requests for maybe an hour or less every couple of weeks, as opposed to what might be requests every week. It might be a frequency question. But the first thing I would do is I would just ask them, what is the reason that they're delayed in reply? And is there anything you can do to help reduce that? Because there may be something completely outside of your control, as all of this is, that you might be able to help with. So they might say, well, it's a lot of requests week after week after week after week. So like, okay, well, I'll go and take a look at the next 5 assignments and I'll take a look at what I need from you. And then I'll just send you a short questionnaire. And if I could get it back in a week, that'd be great, because then I'm moving on to it. Because basically whatever information you can't get from them, you basically go into your assignment and say, have not heard back from client, cannot document, something like that. But generally, if the clients know the value of what they might get out of it, being this participatory volunteer site, they tend to be a little bit quicker. And usually if you chunk everything together, they become a little bit more responsive. Does that help?
Yes, that helps a lot. I think I like that strategy of looking ahead and then checking all the questions together. I have not been doing that. I've only been engaging on an assignment by assignment basis. So I think I should look ahead and then at least a couple of weeks in advance and then chunk those together so that I get them early. I think I'll start doing that. Thank you, Japan.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Great question. Great question. And great questions, everybody. It's been fun conversation today. Lots of good questions. And never forget to really enjoy and play with this process. It's a process that works best if you hold it lightly and you start to ask questions about it and really start to turn things on their head and look at different elements. It's an important piece to keep in mind, because if we get a little too hard and rigid with it, it becomes work. So unless there's any final questions, I'm just going to go back to the list and see if there's anything here. Doesn't look like it. I'm going to check the chat. Doesn't look like it. Okay, so let's jump into taking a look at our upcoming assignments here. Taking a look at our microclimate assignment and taking a look at our water survey. No, this is super weird. I'm confused. Looks like somebody's been messing with the master template again. And the zones are, the assignments are out of order. Huh. That's curious. All right, I've got work to do after this. Let's take a look at the zones. So we had a nice chat about zones today already. So that should be pretty straightforward. You'll take a look at some of the examples within this zone conversation, generally getting full area and full knowledge of these places, getting a sense of what they look like, and then giving us a sense of their usage and then what's being done with them. This can be done as a digital overlay on a hand-drawn map, or can be done completely digitally, as we're seeing here with Lauren's. But generally we get a good sense of these different areas. The footpaths are important. The doors are important. So make sure you put all of those pieces in there. Again, remember that the SWOT analysis is through the lens of this assignment. So taking a look at what are the strengths within this zone layout. So for David, the strengths are it's been left, and we know that there hasn't been a lot of involvement there, which is great because it means that we get to start at a pretty blank slate. Weaknesses are it's probably pretty overgrown, and if we're moving into annual or high production, there's going to be quite a bit of removal, things of that nature. Opportunities might be there's some great elements that we can work with and work on, and threats. Well, if we put things too far away from the house, or if we've got a zone one that's far away, we may not have the activity to work with it. Microclimates, similarly, we tend to stick with blue, orange, yellow, purple, fuchsia, thing of that nature. Again, this is one place where I'll allow some blue if there's a wet area or a shaded area that you want to bring in. But generally, we're trying to get a sense of what are these different areas and generally what are they? And I want 3 different elements. What is the moisture element? So is it wet? Is it dry? What is the heat element? Is it hot? Is it cool? And what is the solar element? So what is that level of, is it sunny? Is it shady? So those 3 elements will come in. You get a chance to put in the different plant identification on your site. So again, if you're just starting out and you're just learning, you might put a little note that says, I think it's this, I'm not too sure, but I think this is what it is. That's fine. We're all learning. I totally get it. And then those microclimate attributes, really getting a sense of the different areas and those different attributes. And then again, that's SWOT analysis. So what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats within the microclimate, within the different plants I'm seeing, really starting to build your comprehension. And this really goes back to the beginning conversation, as I told everybody, this takes years to become good at. You're all starting out, be kind to yourself. You're just learning, it takes time. It took me years to learn what I learned, and then got into a pretty good car accident and lost a fair amount of my plant names, which was fun. So I had to go back and relearn. So it happens. Any questions about that? Any final questions?
Hey, Jim, this is actually Ty Hash.
Hey, Ty.
Just wanted to, I'm actually a couple of lessons behind. I've had a busy end of the semester and some sickness running through the family and all the kids. So,
No worries.
so I'll be trying to catch that up. But yeah, you haven't seen anything from me for a little bit, but should in the future.
Okay, no worries. Nice to see you on the call. Yep, life happens, folks. Life absolutely happens. It takes a lot going on, and as I see you rocking your kid, I totally get it. All right, folks.
Before you go, Yavin,
Go ahead.
I noticed that after you do markings, I receive an email that notifies me that you have scored this much for this current assignment. I realized that I never received that for my lesson 1.
Interesting. I don't know anything about those notifications. That's the first time in 6 years of being in this course that I know that such a thing happens. But let me just quickly take a look and see what lesson 1 looks like. And just give me a quick sec. So yeah, you were the first person to put your assignment in. Huzzah for that. And yeah, we've got your mark there. So I'm not sure what happened. I'll re-enter it here, and hopefully that will resubmit, and you can let me know if that works for you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, you're most welcome. All right, everybody.
I just want to add for the grade stuff, there is a separate grades link, so to say, in the menu. So you can always see what grades you have score out of. That's it.
Perfect. Great. Great, everybody. Well, thanks so much for coming out. It's great to see everybody's faces and hear everybody's voices. I'll be working through any previous assignments this week. Again, don't struggle. If you have a question that you want to put out, feel free to reach out either directly at javin@allpointsdesign.ca or reach out in Canvas as well. All right, folks, take care. Good to see everybody, and we'll see you in the next one.